to now it's like, okay, we got to really make sure we're accomplishing our goals, right? And that we're good stewards of capital. So I think, regardless of what we call it, the fundamentals aren't going to change. Remove friction from revenue generating activities. Full stop.
All right, everybody, welcome to this episode of the RevAmp podcast. Really excited to have Lonnie Sternberg with us here today, and really excited to jump into the conversation. But kind of wanted to kick things off a little bit to kind of frame everything. So, my journey in the this world of RevOps has been pretty interesting because I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Um, I was interviewing for a role, a marketing role, where the target audience was RevOps, and I think I literally had to Google what is revenue operations, right? And if you do that Google search today, um, the lack of clear definition is as obvious as it is today, I think, as it was then, though there are more voices. Um, and the journey since then has been wild because I think that since that time, the role has definitely crystallized. It's become one of the most sought after roles in the interim. Um, and my career trajectory in the tasks I do have kind of shifted into taking on more of those roles as well. And so it's been really an interesting uh, kind of thing to observe. And there have been voices within that, kind of world of RevOps that have bubbled to the surface that to me kind of help influence the way that's defined and the way people think about it. Your voice is one of those, and I'd love to learn a little bit about your kind of journey and how you got to where you were to where you are um, in your career and from a RevOps perspective, and like just kind of how you think about the whole thing.
Yeah, most definitely, Mark. Thanks for having me, man. Really grateful to have the conversation, and I appreciate you sharing your background. The diversity and I would say, the cross-functional influence is what attracts me and keeps me so motivated every day in this sphere. Because folks like yourself, just not everyone has a very cookie cutter, verticalized background. So I think you get a lot of ingenuity and things of that nature, which keeps it fun. In fact, somebody asked me, like, this is a really hard area, like, why do you do it? And I think it's an area where, if you like a challenge and it's dynamic, you get an opportunity to really meet a lot of really great people, and not only meet great people, but people that are always willing to help, and you get your education from them too, and you get to work vertically and horizontally throughout the entire business, and that you get that pass to work there. So my journey specifically was exactly that, like, getting introduced to this recurring revenue model, SaaS and B2B, and then moving through this more operational landscape. But as you're moving through it operationally, you're kind of almost focused on not just the block and tackle of the business, but, like, how do we make money? How do we make customers smile? How do we accomplish the needs of our ECP, our ICP, etc.? And it's RevOps, right? And so I started, for the last 12 plus years, working very cross functionally, coming up through the operational arm, which has been great. Really working and developing teams, dynamic leaders, and focusing on the revenue engines that are going to help penetrate markets and grow revenues, namely predictable. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. And, I think even though that it's been such a dynamic and changing kind of world and role, there were some underlying kind of core things that we all kind of took for granted. That recurring revenue model, creating predictability, like that kind of the engine that supports the tech stack of all that. There were there was variation, but there were kind of things that we all kind of took for granted. I think a lot of that has been the cards have been thrown in the air, and there's just so much up for debate and consideration now that may never have been before. For example, I think that the recurring revenue model, the SaaS model, from a pricing perspective, it was like, you per seat on a monthly or annual basis. That was kind of a given, right? And that's completely changed. And the things that are needed to support those different kind of pricing models and the complexity of that, whether it's usage based or value based or whatever it is, that totally changes everything. Then we had the introduction of AI into the world, which was just has completely reshuffled the deck for everything. And I think that across the board, I think a lot of people don't quite know where this goes. There are the people that think that it'll look nothing like it looks today, and then there are people that I think maybe think these are fads, and it'll mostly kind of stay the same. And then probably most people are somewhere in between. Um, but I actually just posted something on LinkedIn today. From my perspective, and I may be wrong and not seeing it correctly, it does seem that the uptake of AI as a fundamental tool has been slower amongst the RevOps community that I kind of uh, inhabit than other kind of corners of the internet that I explore. And I kind of don't know why. And maybe we can maybe chat a little bit about that to start.
Yeah. So here's what's going through my mind real time. I think that if we, without going too far back in history, we went from it's an uncertain landscape and definition to we have a name, and then we're moving through and it's gaining notoriety, and okay, we have a definition. And I think the most common definition landed around the breaking down silos and aligning success and sales and marketing. And then it graduated a little bit more to say, well, what about like product and finance and the P&L? And then it was like, okay, we're good. And then all of a sudden now, poof, we have AI, and we have all these other possible like kind of definitions. The market, that's micro, right? So macroeconomic, market's a little frothy. We've got some cheaper money, if you will, in the marketplace. Don't growth at all costs is acceptable. To now, it's like, okay, we got to really make sure that we're accomplishing our goals, right, and that we're good stewards of capital. So I think, regardless of what we call it, the fundamentals aren't going to change. And the fundamentals are, if I look at like the oversimplified version, and I talked about this with some other folks too, remove friction from revenue generating activities. Full stop. And I think if you can do that, and you can evidence and you can help using people, process, systems, and tools to increase the percentage or the contribution of revenue per FTE, then we go back to the basics. So answering your question specifically, Mark, I think the adoption or that uptake, if you will, of AI is a little bit slow comparatively from your perspective. And one hypothesis is that RevOps is constantly trying to get alignment and consistency and repeatability, sustainability, scalability, all those words that define predictability. So that is being said, it's like if you go to use AI and you're like, well, yeah, we use this sales methodology. Okay, cool. How consistently? 50% of the time. Then it's like, great, well, where do I use this enhancement or this automation? that's at least kind of my take, for what I see based on the spheres of influencers, my own personal journey, how I'm trying to use ChatGPT, educate myself, etc. And I think some of the best use cases that are going to be early on, my forecast, right or wrong, is taking away some of the reliance on like the discipline of those core departments that are like, I don't want to be disciplined. I just want to go out there and make stuff happen. And if we can use AI to interpret that information and populate fields and, measure, intent signals and indicators and do those things automatically, I think that the machine is going to be a very good predictor of the future, much better than our emotional selves.
For sure. And I think, the use case that pops into my head immediately as you describe that is kind of, the taking notes in the CRM after a sales call, popular. That's like, yeah, so that, and I think that's like the most obvious use case. And, I think, there are definitely some companies involved in that today. Um, one of the other kind of big topics of discussion across the board is, even though there's this massive, relatively speaking, large movement to kind of recognize revenue operations as this critical role. It was the number one most sought after on LinkedIn for a few years. Yeah. There's still often, and more often than it still surprises me. This notion sometimes that RevOps is really just a fancy name for like a CRM admin, and that you're really kind of just taking a list of tasks and fixing fields. Whereas, the core value that RevOps provides is from much more of a strategic perspective, yet often doesn't get that seat at the table. So, from your perspective, kind of, um, how has that trend line looked from, being completely tactical to being strategic, and maybe how can we help bend the curve a little bit to, uh, as somebody in a RevOps role, uh, kind of force the hand to accept that role as being more strategic?
I love this topic, man. I love this question, and I think that there's if we were to build a framework, just verbally around this, right? There's different junctures of the business, and you got. I think it's important to meet the business and the team and everybody where they're at, practice empathy, but also be very strategic. And yeah, it's been a fight. Like, there's this conversation of, oh, we're going to just move from a CRM admin to like a tooling, and then we'll go to like sales ops slash sales enablement. And then that's really just RevOps. We'll just call it RevOps, right? And that's really what that is. And then there's this like, are you working in the business or on the business notion that we've all heard? And then it's the seat at the table and like, how do I get, that empowerment? Like, how do I get verticalized, or how do we get verticalized, like marketing or sales or FP&A or HR, like very clear 40-year-old kind of plus disciplines. Okay, well, what about RevOps? So, I like to think about it in this model of like, is the company at a phase of chaos where it's like we're just trying to get some dollars on the door? Or are we moving to, okay, we've got some momentum, we've got some deal flow, we got money hitting the books, not cash flow positive, but there's a trajectory, right? We have a plan. So you start to grow, you invest, you hire, your first, founding leaders and maybe some, directors or VPs, and you're like, okay, so now we start to build silos, right? Just naturally, because we're not 10 people sitting in a room together. So we're gonna build that, and then you're like, okay, we have alignment. Like we're starting to cook with some gas. We're moving forward. We're launching some new stuff. We're accelerating, etc. And then I think this place where RevOps really can and needs and go is strategic. And then when you're really like pushing the envelope, it's revenue acceleration. Like we're not surviving and doing good. We're doing great. We are aiming for, perfection, and in the process we are reaching excellence. However, you have to be able to float all the way back and forth between, chaos and revenue acceleration, all five phases, because it's almost like a project, or it could be an initiative, or we just went through this M&A, or hey, this contract is ending with this vendor and we need to like refactor this entire data set and model. I think that to me is like exciting. That is where, if you're really strategic in revenue acceleration, I would ask you this question, like, who else in the business, if we think about those very verticalized pillars, is thinking end to end to say, strategically, I'm going to have a seat at this table as an executive leader or influencer, and I'm going to look end to end and talk about how we're going to go. You've set the mandate. Now, how are we going to go do it?
I mean, I can tell you who it should be, but I don't think it often is. I think that, along with the kind of misunderstanding that often comes with RevOps role, I think the role of the chief revenue officer often gets misunderstood. And, I kind of see them as supposed to be, the kind of corporate executive that sits across that whole thing. But oftentimes it just becomes the head of
Yeah,
sales.
yeah, yeah, totally. I think that's a great perspective, because that person that's got to look end to end, right? If you are like, let's say, let's use the definition of CRO and say oversight of marketing, sales, enablement, and success, right? So end to end, all revenue generating streams. Like they've got to have you know, some people in the foxhole working with them, whether it be a direct report, or just a dotted line, or they're not even a dotted line, but they're a partner, right? Because how do you look at all of those factors and influencing components to make sure that they hit their objectives?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so, you're talking about um, this kind of trajectory from chaos to revenue acceleration. Um, it's interesting because I've always found that no matter where I've kind of been, even if it on outside it looks like the most uh, well-oiled machine, if you look under the hood, you're going to find chaos, right? So there's always a lot, especially in the tech world, especially if you're, regardless of stage, but like in the startup, chaos is the norm. Um, so is it binary? Is it like, or can it be there's chaos and revenue acceleration kind of at the same time? And yeah.
I think I think there's always, to your point, man, totally aligned. I think there's going to always be a level of chaos, like, and I think that's where the quotes of like chaos of opportunity or bringing order to chaos, et cetera, come from. Is that it's always going to have change in dynamics, right? And I don't know that you don't reach that zeros and ones, binary component. I think, but just the simple fact of recognizing it, and I think looking at like a strategic scorecard and saying like, hey, like this part of the business is doing really, really good. Like we've reached a very predictable, consistent level of revenue acceleration or strategic. This is a hot mess over here, and this is chaos, and it might be okay, right? Because you're weighing like risks and benefits to say, okay, we can just live with that. But I think just number one, aligning on like core definitions, having a good understanding of like where the business is accelerating or decelerating, and then having, okay, what are we going to do and how are we going to put a plan to move that along, and is that the right area of focus? So I don't think it's binary, and I don't think it has to be binary, but I think now today I feel, based on, kind of where we're at overarchingly, we're starting to talk more about the block and tackle and this consistency, and why it's interesting, right? I mean, think about it. Why are we talking about so much like repeatability today in the era of AI?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I would imagine it has something to do with the cautious nature of capital at the moment, wanting to have more predictability in their models because of the difficulty of the last few years.
Yeah, so I think, but I think for me, it's interesting that those core block and tackle concepts aren't going to, I think, be necessarily like the ways of the future to do something better. But I don't think they're going to go out there. I don't think they're going to expire because the fundamentals of a P&L, right? The fundamentals of accounting, those don't, I don't think they're changing necessarily.
For sure. Yeah, I think what does change and what is changing is like what's expected to be like needed in order to scale.
Exactly. And that I think takes us full circle, 100%. So eloquently said. That takes us full circle back to what is RevOps. Is it an experiment, or is this a cost center, or is this a revenue generating center on the P&L? And why do we need it? And what do you do?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm interested to know from your perspective is like there's definitely, you mentioned it briefly, there we lived in a world of growth at all costs for a while, right? We were in the zero interest rate times where, we all had our Scrooge McDuck like coin pools that we swam into. Um, and then that went away real quick, and a lot of people were caught off guard, and a lot of companies just didn't adapt quickly enough, and some are still struggling. um, but what is clear is that there's definitely a do more with less mentality. And while AI hasn't fully replaced jobs necessarily, it certainly has allowed companies to do more with less headcount. And I wonder, in that trajectory, does the responsibility of RevOps increase because so much of that doing more with less needs to be facilitated by some sort of technology and overseeing kind of the way those pieces work together? I mean, is the responsibilities and challenges on a RevOps on someone on RevOps going to just continue to increase going forward?
Yeah, I'll break that apart into kind of two things. Because again, like, awesome dialogue. I think number one, when like, if we were just talking about like just basic economics, at what juncture did anybody think it would be a good idea to not be frugal or a good steward of capital, right? So, to me, it's like, no one's perfect. I'm not playing the blame game, but I think that through good times, through bad times, through 0% interest rates or 10% interest rates, it's got to make dollars and cents. Like, it has to. And I think the companies right now that are like really moving forward were disciplined throughout that journey and that life cycle. And to your point, the companies that were cavalier or more cavalier are like, oh, like, how are we going to back into this? And we have a major problem. And I think that's what's driving somewhat of, let's just call it, a non-formal correction in some regard. So if we take that and just think about that for a second, and then we move into your question specifically around RevOps and AI and more responsibility, I think what AI does and the technology, it actually helps everybody when fully adopted, and the fundamentals and block and tackle pieces are there. And I think we're going to see it's going to take some time to get there, right? It's going to take some time to be like, yeah, AI, us saying, hey, Mark, we really need to put AI into this. This is a use case, is going to be the forcing hand to getting the block and tackle perfect and on paper for once and for all, right? If you will. Then the revenue operations people, if you will, have this gateway and window to now get this bigger seat at the table because they're not necessarily in some regards stuck rinsing and doing the same things manually or over and over. For example, I was just doing a beta test infusing AI into a platform of it's another founder in our sphere, and they have the ability to, I load a data set and then I do a short explanation to explain what it is and what's the scenario and the persona I would like the agent to take on. And then a deck comes out and I have all these beautiful graphs and all of this information and an opinion on the data. Like, that's huge. And then when Mark says to me, "Hey, well, what if this happened?" It's like, "Oh, let's change that." That's what happens. And like, not, I'll get back to you in a few days. And I got to go back to Google Slides and I've got to go slide a new one in. So I think like adoption of those types of things is going to get some of the administrative or the things that were taking all of us like longer to do to accelerate. So I think yeah, in some regards, it might be, needing less. But I mean, I would have to ask the question back to the original sentiment of like, did we always need all of that? Or was that more of like, we can?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's like so much has been, like I said, reshuffled that we're clearly in this on the cusp of a very, big change and across the board. Um, and I think causing people to question kind of fundamental assumptions for businesses leading up to now. Um, among the interesting and maybe kind of buzzy trends that have kind of come across the wire lately is this kind of newly defined role that I don't even know if anyone has actually taken on this role or if it was just kind of a point of discussion. But what they're calling a go-to-market engineer, GTM engineer, and there was a lot of debate as to what it is. Is it really different than RevOps, or is it just kind of new branding? Um, so I would love to kind of get your hot take on
Yeah,
this.
this is a hot one, man. This, yeah. So when I've read probably the same materials that you read, as far as like the let's call it like the larger landscape or influencing conversations, and to be very clear, like I'm not opposed or trying to advocate. I'm just going to answer this very objectively. Um, I think that there's fundamentals that are being described that have always needed to be a facet of a revenue operations leader. Number one. So number two, I think with this concept of like doing less with more, AI and all the tooling, it's like, oh, well, let's just GTM engineer. It's like, well, wait a second. If you had a company that needed, let's just call it a team of five for right now, and they were all within RevOps, would you have a systems architect? Would you have a solutions architect? Would you have somebody that understands the core competencies of the platforms and the technological, components better than someone else? They're expertised in it, but they still are focused on doing all those things. Or is it this idea that like, okay, well, we'll create this role, and the thought is that you can have like three or four or two, whatever, however many you want to use arbitrarily, like just powerhouse platforms, and you can just do the customer blueprint and the bow tie end to end, and you don't even need to do all those other pieces in the middle. But then I think if you do that, right, you're going back to our earlier components of our conversation of like chaos, siloed, aligned, strategic, and revenue. That's assuming that's all there and it's working and there's no changes. And if there is, you have so much sophistication and alignment of the tooling that like you click a button and it just it fixes it, and then it just goes end to end all the way through. So I think there's a lot of like assumption there. And I think it's unique based on somewhat of the business model. I also think, though, in a positive way, though, this concept of a go-to-market engineer is saying, hey, like you need to think about this as an engine, not just like tooling or breaking down silos or alignment, but like it's a full-blown engine and it has to be engineered and it needs to be blueprinted and polished. And the smoother the engine runs, the more efficiency we're going to get out of it. So I think there's some positive dynamics there. It's just some of it, I think, come from a titling standpoint, helps support certain, I think, initiatives and maybe even business models today versus, just globally calling it, one unified naming convention and then applying it across, a couple of businesses. Now I think there's this big shift to say, hey, we're, how many businesses do you see like, hey, we're an AI company? Or we're AI first, or we're infusing AI into our product. It's like, okay, like everyone's an AI company now.
I mean, I think it was Satya Nadella has this whole thing that that's basically the future, right? This whole CRUD. I forgot what that acronym stands for, but that's the basis of all business. Yeah. It's the basis of all web applications that we all use, right? It's like create, remove, update, delete, or something.
Yeah, create, remove. Yeah, they're very verticalized, like just basically containers. And then now we're moving to this interactive pendulum, which is 100%. But I think what he's just defining there is like very different than where most people are at and what they're calling AI. Like that's a whole nother like, that's like minors and majors.
Yeah, he's laying out, I think, a future vision, which I also tend to agree with. Um, but when I hear when I heard GTM engineering, so my immediate, without kind of reading how this was supposedly defined, my immediate kind of thought about it was a few things. One is that there's been a lot of consolidation in tech stack, for example, whereas yeah, we had a lot of point solutions. Those really, a lot of those have been removed and focusing on the core platforms that make up the sources of truth within your tech stack. And in order to kind of fill the gaps that are left now, this person would kind of step in, and the democratization of engineering knowledge has greatly increased with some of these AI tools out there. So, like, even if you're not a developer, if you understand systems and someone needs to build an add-on or an extra thing, go to Cursor or vo.dev or Bolt, and being able to build like those kind of bespoke internal tooling, going with the metaphor of the engine, right? So instead of buying aftermarket things to soup up your engine, actually getting in there and rolling your sleeves up and doing it yourself. That's kind of how I envisioned what that role is talking about. And I think it's actually a pretty interesting concept because I find myself doing some of this stuff also, stepping in and kind of filling the gap where maybe a point solution would have been the solution previously, saying, oh, you know what, I think we maybe can build that internally and make that work for you. So I wonder if I don't know if that's really how it was ever defined, but that's kind of how I.
Yeah, I mean, I think I interpret that as like a little bit more self-reliance to say like, hey, can we use native API calls versus having to go buy like a third-party platform that's just going to go allow these workflows because they basically that was their business model, right? They created this interface for the user to interact to say, oh, we get A and B to talk, but you need our integrator because they're the economic buyer didn't want to rely on a third party inside the company to be put in a ticket and like go do that when you need that. So I think that's like 100%. I mean, even if we just talk like, arguably the largest CRM in the world, Salesforce, being able to just go inside and like use AI to be like, hey, how do I build this flow? Like versus struggling for someone to go build it, or how do I go do this one thing? Or and in fact, I was talking to another friend slash professional, and their product is like, hey, we're a plugin, if you will, but like you just kind of AI chat through this and it's going to go write it and then put it in Salesforce. I'm like, that's awesome, because I don't like, then I can focus on strategic more so than focusing on, okay, I got to go do trial and error and spin up this flow and test it and see if it's going to work. Like their interface, like someone way smarter than me figured out how to make that so it's easy for me. So that part of it, yeah, man. I mean, I think that's a very useful component. So is that a person or is it a consolidation of everybody? I don't know. I mean, I think again, it depends on where the business is at.
Yeah. So I think the thing I kind of would be interested to end the conversation on, and get your insight on is, I think there is a lot of, across the board, but let's say RevOps, there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe fear for people about, how do I, uh, increase the likelihood of staying relevant? How do I build my own moat in my role so that I don't get left behind in this kind of technological shift that we're in? And what would be your suggestion about someone in a RevOps role? How do they um, you know build their own moat and make themselves unreplaceable in the future world that we're heading towards?
Great question. I think I think I'm going blank on his name, but one of your previous pods, you guys talked a lot about this, and I listened to it. It was very enjoyable. Great job. Um, I I think that the way I'm thinking about certain elements is like, and I think this is where some of the pressure comes from. How do I be everything? How do I be tactical? How do I be strategic? Like things are flying at us, and everybody right now. And the breadth and depth has been, you know, there from end to end customer journey, right? Not just like, oh, I'm in an engineering and I can just really focus on this, so to speak, for a lack of better, descriptions. I think that it's a lot of it's going to be situational based on how the ELT, thinks about the certain departments and the buy-in, if you will, and the alignment of the department, so to speak. Um, I think some companies are bringing RevOps in to be reactive because, like, hey, everyone else is doing it, we should do it. I think some people are building RevOps for the right ways to say we need this sphere or center, this the someone to worry about all the sources of truth. And I like how you put that. It's not source anymore, right? It's sources. Um, and then I'll also think that if you're out the old, if you're offering value, right, then you're good. And so the question is that a localized thing or is that a globalized thing? And maybe the definitions and the titles start to shift and people start to shift into it. And the people that are like really pushing themselves to be, continuously learning and growing and participating and adopting and trying to utilize AI and being very forward thinking, I think are gonna, end up creating value. So I think it's gonna come down to a lot of trust relationships. But the titles could shift. I mean, it could, but if the function has worked and the statistics that I've read are showing that companies with revenue operations are a pretty substantial percentage more successful based on like probability of revenue attainment and profitability. That's what I've read. I didn't do the study. Then I would say it's more just back to organizational alignment, and then what do you want to call it? But and then being clear on where does it start and stop. But I don't think it's going away or it's not needed. It's just a matter of continuing to. If there's a new variable and it's being refined, and it's only it's early and it's a life cycle. 10 arguably 12 years, right? So again, it's like, what's this thing? Does that answer your question?
Very much. And I think that's a great way to put a pin in it for now. And very interested to see how it all plays out in the future. Lonnie, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, if there's anywhere the folks at home can maybe go to learn more about you and the stuff you're doing, now's a great time to kind of throw it
Yeah, I
out there.
appreciate that. Yeah, huge proponent of just staying active on LinkedIn. I've got some information about me and some other pods and stuff on that page. And if you're listening to this and you'd like to connect and DM me, I'd love to offer value and be supportive.
Awesome. All right, Lonnie, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.